What up, Coordination? How you doing? On the pod today we have Philip Sheldrake, who is a writer, a thinker, an educator, and a moral philosopher who is on this episode. We're going to be talking about identity. So if you've been following the pod for a while, you know that we've been treating decentralized identity as the key, the gate that if we go through it, we can unlock lots of positive sum games. And that's what unlocks the Regen Web3 community. And Philip was an interesting guest to have on the pod because we're kind of critiquing Web3 approaches to identity and how they don't fully represent the identity that we as humans have in our social relationships, in how we model ourselves and how we act in the world. And so on this podcast, we talk a little bit about the differences between social science and computer science, studying what works and creating what works in the world. We talk about what could go wrong with decentralized identity, Chinese social credit scoring stuff, some of the atrocities that happened in World War II due to the fact that the identity registries happened in the wrong hands. And basically, we talk about whether or not markets or community or other mechanisms, other organizing vehicles are a good way of building collective identity systems. So Philip, like me, is a doomer optimist. So basically someone who is thinking that, oh man, the trajectory that we're on, this accelerationist trajectory with capitalism running up against planetary boundaries, means that we're sort of doomed in some ways. But we're also optimistic because we have the tools to turn the corner and build a more regenerative cryptoeconomic internet. So Philip is one of my favorite guests because I think he really challenges my thinking and causes us to complexify the design space and make sure that we're not missing anything. So I think it was a good Green Pill episode if you're into digital identity. So without further ado, I give you Philip Sheldrake, and we're talking about digital identity on this episode. Enjoy.
The world has woken up to refi, and CELO is here for it. CELO is the layer one for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. CELO has committed to producing a sustainable future from day one and has built its technology around one of the lowest carbon impact consensus mechanisms, and is the world's first carbon negative EVM compatible layer one blockchain. CELO is a movement to create the conditions of prosperity for everyone, whether it's tokenizing carbon credits with Toucan, providing capital to underserved communities with Unicorn, or building for millions of users around the globe. CELO was created to transform crypto enthusiasts into a movement of changemakers. Follow along on Twitter at CELO.org to learn more about how CELO is accelerating refi for a positive, lasting impact on people, communities, and the planet. And if you're a builder interested in refi, be sure to join the Build with CELO hackathon live now with a prize pool of over $100,000. COINSHIFT is a leading treasury management and infrastructure platform for DAOs and crypto businesses that need to manage their treasury operations. Every crypto org needs to manage its treasury, and COINSHIFT offers a simple, flexible, and efficient multi-chain treasury management platform built on top of the highly secure Gnosis Safe. With COINSHIFT, your organization can go from primitive single-chain treasury management to expressive, flexible, and multi-chain treasury features, such as global user management, global contacts, proposal management, and many other features that can be shared across an entire organization, allowing users to save time and reduce operational burdens and gas costs. COINSHIFT even has data tools like account reporting across the 7 chains on which it operates. Used by industry powerhouses such as Uniswap Grants, Balancer, Consensus, and Masari, COINSHIFT is speeding up the coordination and efficiency of the organizations that use it. You have to keep up with the frontier, and COINSHIFT makes that easy. So sign up at coinshift.xyz/bankless.
Hey, Philip, how's it going?
Very good. Thanks for inviting me here.
Yeah, have really enjoyed our discussions thus far about digital identity, but really a lot of things that are Green Pill related. You wrote this really amazing essay, Digital Identity is Not Human Identity, and That Matters. And I'm wondering if we could pull the threads of some things on that piece. But before we do, I just found out that you've been listening to some Green Pill episodes, and you think that this piece responds to not just the digital identity part, but like the whole doomer optimism, solar punk movement. I think will be in scope for our conversation. So where should we start?
Well, hey, I'm a doomer optimist. There's no doubt about that. We find ourselves in a precarious position, needing to cooperate, to coordinate at scale in ways that our species has never had to before. And hey, wonderful, we've got this set of digital technologies just at the point where we might need something unprecedented to see if we can resolve that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm optimistic in that sort of doom optimism way, at the same point thinking there's a clash of paradigms. We don't yet have the the necessary transdisciplinarity to try and resolve this with what cyberneticists refer to as the requisite variety. It's a hell of a series you're running, and I love the name GreenPilled. I love the Doomer Optimism. I love the Solar Punk, and this is exactly the conversation we need to be having about Web3's application.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'd love to pull the thread on this meme of doomer optimism. So to me, that means that like we're heading on this trajectory where we're doomed. We're consuming exponential amounts of resources on a linear materials economy. We're really struggling to transition from the industrial age to the information age and all of the problems that come along with that, around trusting people across physical distance, around increasing Dunbar's numbers so we can become a truly global scale civilization. So like we're doomed in some ways, and the optimism comes from the fact that we can actually change it. We can actually move towards something that is
Oh yeah.
Able to meet its moment, build mechanisms that can meet their moment, and build civilizational scale collective intelligence that can govern democratically, but also responsibly the resources on this planet. So that's what doomer optimism means to me. I'm curious what it means to you.
No, it's exactly that. And if anyone's watching this and hasn't seen the 2 episodes you recorded with Daniel Schmartenberger, hey, press pause on this one now and go and watch it, right? Because he sets up the meta crisis as 2 strong attractors. There's the many ways in which we could have catastrophe in the world, from nuclear war to desktop CRISPR to general artificial intelligence. The list is quite long. And then we have the opportunity in another attractor basin of a dystopia, which is the nation states trying to rise up to get control over what could be a catastrophe, but then you end up with just authoritarian states, and that's dystopian. So the metacrisis sort of hypothesis is that we need to develop a third attractor together where we can exert the necessary control to avoid the catastrophes, but without the concentration of power that leads to those Orwellian futurescapes.
That's great. Well, so I think that covers the doomer optimism point, why we're optimistic, but why we're doomer optimists. So, I mean, I've kind of long felt that digital identity is one of the keys to solving this puzzle, because you can build more positive sum games when you have repeating relationships and you have people that are sort of building their own identities, like state on an individual actor level. And I think that a lot of your essay is around the pitfalls of that. And so I'd really love to get into that part of the discussion now, because I think that that's one of the really important points when we're designing mechanisms that are going to get us out of this doomer optimism place. So where should we start with respect to your essay, which, by the way, will be linked in the show notes?
Awesome. So let's link where we got to on the meta crisis and this third attractor to the question of digital identity, because so far digital identity in that Web 1, Web 2 sort of way was very much similar to the way in which information technologists, computer scientists have addressed machines. They've addressed machines rather well at global scale, and many of them you could accuse them, if you're being a little bit cynical, of assuming that they can just now do the same for the 8 billion of us human beings. But it's not just a technological proclivity that sort of embeds that as a mindset. It's also the history, the culture of computer science. If you go back to the introduction of computing, the very first customers were nation states and large corporations who wanted to make you, me, your viewers, and Alice, as we often refer to the user, if we want to try and humanize them.
Alice and Bob.
Alice, Bob, and Charlie, yeah. We want to make them legible to the system. So if you look at Scott's work in Sing Like a State, the state wants to make you legible to the state. You are, in fact, a number when it comes to the state bureaucracy. And so computing has developed an approach which is very similar in terms of allowing the system to make the user legible to it. So it's all about system legibility. It's not about what it means to be human. It's not about living processes. It's incredibly reductionist, very straightforward. What is this
Right.
user? How do we refer to this user again and again and again? How do we know it's the same user?
Mhm.
And what rights can we pin on it, her, him? So this has served us kind of well up until I would say about 15 years ago, which is around about the time in my mind I think we moved from that state where we were referring to going online, right? It's the point where the digital became a little bit more pervasive. You were never quite disconnected from it. Obviously, interacting with screens is one thing, but even just moving around your home, moving around your town, your city, you're interacting with things that are digitalized, even if they don't have a screen. And so
Right.
now the living process of being a human being, particularly in the developed world, is very much now digitalized. People like Florida at Oxford and Bratton, who wrote the Stack that I know has been referred to on the GreenPilled before, um,
Mhm.
just now recognize that we are kind of cyborg, not in that sort of Hollywood way of having a robotic arm or an X-ray eye, but more that some of the feedback loops, the cybernetic feedback loops that feature in our sense making in our living are digitalized. The way we sense
Mhm.
the world, the way we think about the world, and then the way that we act in the world. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
we have digital identity, and that's very different. So I've tried to write an essay over the summer, which is called Human Identity, the number one challenge in computer science.
Mhm.
And it says it's the number one challenge in computer science because computer scientists have joined a very, very small group of bureaucrats. They are
Mhm.
now possibly just alongside lawyers in terms of trying to work out how to code for society, how to make Alice legible to the system. So they treat identity very much as noun like. You and I are things that you can point at, refer to consistently throughout our lifetime, not just the birth certificate, collecting taxes, signing up for the armed forces if needed, and then your death,
Mhm.
but in every other aspect of bureaucratic life. Meanwhile, if it's not law, if it's not computer science, all of the other disciplines that might be said to have some interest in human flourishing
Mhm.
treat identity as a verb like, as a process, as a capacity for sense making. So we have
Mhm.
this clash of paradigms. And at the moment, um, I tried to find language that techies will resonate with. And one of the things Kevin came up with was this idea of backward compatibility, making the
Mhm.
digital system compliant with the legacy system. And
Mhm.
what's interesting in the field of digital identity is that the legacy system, human identity, is so incredibly more highly powered, more highly
Mhm.
capable than the digital constructs, the digital architectures, the digital code and protocols that we have today. So,
Mhm.
the key, I think, in terms of allowing uh, the progression of designing for identity as a sense making capacity,
Mhm.
uh, that is the key to melding the cyborgian individual
Right.
in the 21st century into a member of society, a decentralized society that can respond in 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 ways that keep those catastrophes at arm's length, but
Mhm.
don't lead us to those authoritarian state outcomes.
Right. So, I mean, I think that, like, if I was to sort of say back to you what you just said, I think the one that stands out to me is that, we talked about Seeing Like a State, this book in which we talk about how the government wants to make the humans legible to the state so that it can manipulate them or track them or whatever. And with digital identity, it almost feels like we're building digital systems that aren't really state anchored. So let's say, like, seeing like the internet, so basically being able to see the actors like the internet. And there's this thrash in there between computer science and social science with respect to, are we building what's best for the data structures, or are we actually building something for the humans in this? in this system. And then of course there's all the ways that that could go wrong. Chinese social credit scoring, authoritarian regimes rounding up people, as we saw in World War II, and all the things that could go off the rails there. I don't know if that's a fair summary, but I'm just trying to say it in another language for the listener.
It's fantastic. In fact, to use some of the language that I've heard you use on previous episodes of GreenPilled, I guess my work is trying to speed run digital identity. I'm trying to identify the flaws now while it's relatively cheap to develop, as opposed to when it's out in the world. So I've been kind of red teaming it, if you like. And often that can come down to mindset. So let me give you an example. You will see around lots of Web3 slide stacks, Web3 websites, this idea of sovereignty and owning your personal data. So let's just, now, before I go into sovereignty and owning your personal data, let me just take one step back to talk about this verb-like identity. Because in that instance, identity is immanent, as in arises out of social relationships. And social relationships are immanent, they rise out of the exchange of information. So you and I have chatted on a couple of instances now, and we're both trying to make sense of each other. We're trying to figure out, how can I help each other? How can we coordinate? How can we collaborate? Where might this guy be useful? Who should I introduce him to? What connections can I make? This is all about sense making, one's role in this, in a social sense. And so when I talk about sovereignty, I'm again with Schmartenberger, who in his Consilience project would frame that in terms of a capability for sentience, sensing the world, a capability for cognitive processes, thinking that through, finding meaning in what you've sensed, and then actuation, how to behave in the world to contribute to your community. Contrast that with sovereignty as it's often used in Web3 communications collateral, which can be taken as a synonym for control, for being supreme ruler of one's life. It's as if the people who write that kind of read some Ayn Rand novels and kind of stopped there, because it's an incredibly reductionist way of looking at how the human species works. And so once you have a complex lens, you stop trying to be so reductionist about it. You don't come up with an idea such as KYC DAO, for example. KYC DAO is classic computer science thinking. How can we make 8 billion people legible with one universal identity in the world, effectively? As if it's the human body that counts rather than our intellectual, our cognitive abilities. So when I say noun-like, even though the noun-like has been adopted by information technologists, so you'd think they'd be drawn to some informational qualities, you find again and again and again that in the literature of digital identity, they're obsessed with the physical, the corporeal, the animal, and the idea of this being one body must therefore mean I only need one identifier in the digital system. And yet the thing that sets our species apart is our ability for cognition. We have enormous brains compared to other species. And the brain is a biological unit, but the mind is informational and is not contained in here. So for example, we are using words, and the only reason we can have this conversation and people can tune in to watch it and make sense of it is that we're all using a common vocabulary, a common semantic. We have that ability in common, but it doesn't sit in any one brain. It's the thing that sets us apart, and yet it's nothing to do with the corporeal. So for me, a generative identity, an approach to the digitalization of identity that tries to play to the psychology, the sociology, and the ecology, the self, the culture, and the nature, is more likely to play to the sovereignty of the individual defined in terms of their sentience, intelligence, and agency than anything that looks like a database of identifiers.
Well, let me probe with that a little bit. And by the way, like I guess is it a fair summary to say of everything that you just said that like really the computer science should be trailing the social science, not the social science being moving towards the computer science? Is that too reductionist?
Do you know what? You see, this is why you're in the seat. You're a good communicator, right? You've boiled it down. At the end of the day, so the social sciences, because of course there are many, have studied for centuries how people work, what the good life is, how to live sustainably, generatively, and yet that's not the expertise of computer scientists. And yet, if computer science is going to contribute to that, then yes, they need to work into the social sciences in a way that I haven't seen yet. If you look at any book or paper on the question of digital identity, just go and find the disciplinary basis of the authors, and often you will find there might be an economist, which I guess is a social science, albeit one that tends to keep itself somewhat isolated from the others, or a techie. You won't find, for some bonkers reason, on any digital identity team, a psychologist, a sociologist, an anthropologist, an ecologist, someone well studied in cultural studies or gender studies. None of these people hardly exist. If you see a Web3 job advert, you can bet your life it's for a dev. And not for someone who understands the human condition and has made it their lifelong study.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like this is almost like a critique of capitalism in a way, because the technology that's going to be built is going to be a function of what's funded. And if you look at what's funded, it's going to be things that are going to create the most venture scale return. And that's a reason why more humanity spends its time on TikTok consuming viral content than it does studying the Stoic philosophy of what's going to make for a good life. And I think that there's sort of a race to the bottom of the brainstem that results out of that attention economy, where the things that grab your attention most instead of the things that grab your values, that are reflect your deeper values upon quiet meditative and inspection is what the system is going to produce. So I would back out of that a criticism of our funding infrastructure as much as our technology. And I guess the question that's on the tip of my tongue is, how might we engineer a digital identity system and a regenerative cryptoeconomic internet that pulls people towards their best selves and towards what they actually value is the question on the tip of my tongue when I frame it like that. So do you agree with that framing? And if so, are there any projects that are doing it right that you've seen? I'd be curious for your take on that.
I do agree with that framing. Again, you can see I studied your interviewing with Daniel Schmartenberger. He just said that we define problems too narrowly, and so that the solution, air quotes, creates other problems. And this is well understood in anyone whose domain is a complex domain. And do you mind if I just hesitate to pause on this question of complexity? I know that Z did a good job of defining it, but for those who haven't seen that episode,
you're talking about Michael Zargam, the episode that we did with Michael Zargam.
Yeah, definitely. The way I try and describe it quite simply is that if you take a car is complicated because it's made up of lots of separate bits, but it's not complex because the definition of complexity is it can demonstrate emergent behaviors that perhaps were not foreseen, perhaps are unintended. And by definition, you do not want a car to behave in ways that weren't designed, right? At the same time, traffic isn't complicated because it just consists of cars. But it sure is complex because we've all been stuck in a traffic jam and we're convinced there must be an accident up ahead. But sure enough, the traffic eventually clears and there's no sign whatsoever of an accident. We've evolved to want to see a cause and effect. Accident, therefore jam. Complexity doesn't work so in such a way. It's and yet at the same time, it's the thing we must build. So there is a lot of understanding about complex systems emerged in one of the tracks in the Macy conferences in the 50s and 60s that became called cybernetics. And cybernetics, if you like, is the science of organizing, the science of setting a goal, typically in a large system, and working out how to get yourself there, which is exactly what we're talking about in terms of this third attractor in the meta crisis. And I'm going to put this out of that work, the idea of what governing was formalized. So we've had governors for thousands of years. You can't run a steam engine without something to let off the steam, right? That's called a governor. A governor helps the system maintain a stasis for doing productive work. But the cyberneticians were the first to formalize governance and try and make it a science. And this is Zarkin's thing, right? This is where it's coming from. Love the man. So the law of requisite variety came out of this work, which I actually prefer when it's slightly reframed as the law of requisite complexity. So let me just find that framing, because this is perhaps, there it is. The internal complexity of a system must match the external complexity it confronts. In other words, the system you build to govern decentralized society or allow for that governance to emerge must be richer in variety, richer in permutations, richer in possibilities than the thing that you're confronted with, which is why when we are thinking about design, we're thinking about decentralizing, because we don't see large-scale centralization in nature. It's not biomimetic. And so when you look at the Decentralized Society paper that I know you've discussed again
right.
On the Green Pill episode, the ambition is absolutely right. We cannot get to the third attractor by definition through centralization. And yet, of course, decentralization, as Nathan Schneider argues, is just a means. It's not an end itself. It's not the thing we should be, it's not the altar we should be worshipping at. It's a means to an end. And you can have utopian decentralized society, and you can have terrifying decentralized society. Only if we design in the requisite variety, the requisite complexity, can we get the outcomes that can we work towards, continuously work towards the outcomes that signify a good life, a sustainable life, living in harmony with the other species we share this planet with, such that future generations can also benefit in exactly the same way. Now, if you look at digital identity projects the world over, none are coming close at the moment to demonstrating the requisite variety, the requisite complexity. Like as not, they continue to be zoomorphic, noun-like, undynamic ways for us to uniquely identify the corporeal as opposed to the cognitive power that we need to release to develop the collective intelligence and the collective wisdom for our species going forward. Damn, I've been speaking for a while now. I should pause and let you get some direction in here.
Yeah, it'd be fun if we can kind of ping pong back and forth on some of these things. So one of the things that I would like to interject, and I actually think it's one of the tensions between my styles and your communication style, Philip, which is maybe a little bit meta. Well, no. There is no absolute better. There's only better for better things. And one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about is, I have this like complexity part of my brain, which loves these complex systems and trying to figure them out because they're so consequential for the world. But I also have the mimeticist part of my brain, which is like, how can I take this, like all of these ideas and boil them down into 4 words or less, or into some visual that will help people understand the concept. And it comes down to this quote that I heard on Sam Harris's podcast, which was, nuance is the enemy of common understanding. So nuance, which is the ability to understand complexity, is the enemy of common understanding. And that's because we all have short attention spans, and we're glued to Twitter, and we're glued to our information rich, abundant environment. So our attention has to be very tight about what we put in there. And so it feels like there's this tension where we have no capacity for nuance. And because of that, when things have externalities in them, or they're too complex to fit into 280 characters, the populace doesn't understand them, and it makes it really hard to build a democratic system, find that third attractor from there. So I'd love to hear your reaction to not that critique, but or I guess that that
I
constraint.
want to respond to that critique because it's absolutely spot on. I have developed an expertise to go across the disciplines in order that I can find the bits in between. Because the disciplines are just an emergent accident, right? There's no reason why we should have psychology and sociology and computer science and information sciences. They just emerge, right? So I try and find the gaps in between. It's not just multidisciplinary in terms of getting everybody in a room. It's not just interdisciplinary where they try and learn each other's phrasing and languages. It's transdisciplinary where you attend to those gaps and you build new wisdom together in combination with all the stakeholders. Part and parcel of getting all those stakeholders in the room is the participation of awesome communicators such as yourself, who have that that mimetic talent to help people understand why it's important. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you exhibit that skill better than I do. We all exhibit incredible skills that are needed in the mix. None of us, again, as a kind of by the way of a critique of this worshipping of the self-made man, the atomization of the individual, that is not how we got here. We are social animals. We are more powerful in social groups than we are as individuals. And that's exactly the approach we now need to take in terms of pursuing generative identity. That's identity pursued for psychological, sociological, and ecological health. We need to get all those people in the room, including people who can convene that room and who are great at translating some of the jargon, some of the rarefied lexicon into something that everybody understands. I mean, I've tried that in my own little way with, rather than trying to convey the variety of conceptualizations of identity outside of law, outside of computer science, rather than try and do that and get everybody in computer science to follow that, I've found that this categorization of the conceptualizations help. If you're developing noun-like and you're not attending to the verb-like, then that could be a problem. It could be a problem in as much as the more we codify the noun-like, the more it can be a pollutant. It can be valuable in tight application, but left to spread and be pervasive in the way that digital technologies enable, it will suffocate the verb-like. And given that I'm saying that the verb-like conceptualizations are what it means to be human, that's not good news. So I'm trying to find the right language to attract people's attention.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think what you said about getting people with complementary intelligences in the room is so important. And maybe I think that one of the things that I think I think that we need to create like Schelling points where people can have these conversations and define these things and collaborate. And maybe trying to do it on Twitter and on TikTok and on Facebook is too wide of an audience, and we just focus on the change makers for now, thinking that those will ripple out. But I really do wonder when we're building democratic systems, some of these trade-offs with verb-like identity versus noun-like identity, are those things that the common populace has to understand, or are they kind of like downstream from that? If we're going to build a democracy, then you think you need the consent of the governed for these decisions, and that's the constraint where I just worry a lot about it.
Yeah, but you are trying to enable that conversation for those who have the privilege and the time to attend to that conversation. You are trying to bring people into the conversation. Well, I'm always struck actually by the difference between the two disciplines that code for society, lawyers and computer guys and gals, mostly guys, unfortunately. It used to be 50-50 in the 50s, but it's increasingly like 95-5, and that in itself is mind-blowingly wrong. To write legal code is an incredibly diligent process that you can participate in if you have many years of training. Anybody can write lines of code. Now, in a way, that's why we all love the digital, right? It's incredibly, it's rich with potential, and we're very excited about applying it, and we need to apply it in the right way. So this is fantastic. It is all inclusive, and I'm not bemoaning that at all. At the same time, the people who are writing the digital code that they hope will set us free can only do that at the moment largely from their monodisciplinary, monocultural, often monogendered perspective. They cannot, because they do not have the requisite variety, get it right. So we have to expand this design conversation. There is no other way in which we can go about generative identity.
Yeah. By generating.
Let me give you an example. So you had Danny on from 3Box of ceramic protocol fame, and I have a lot of time for Danny. He is what we say in London, a diamond geezer, right? But it's worth tuning in to see how 3Box and many others are approaching this idea of reputation. So when he was on GreenPilled, he quoted Jonathan Haidt's Righteous Mind. And Haidt actually quotes Plato's brother, whose name was Glaucon, I think. Maybe I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but where Glaucon came to the conclusion that said that an important principle in designing an ethical society is to make sure that everyone's reputation is on the line all the time. And this has been demonstrated mathematically now. If you read the book Super Cooperators, for example, it is integral, it's innate to the human species that this is the case. But notice its reputation is always on the line, not reputation is always online. And some people have confused this, and for example, with the salt-based tokens idea, and when you have reputation that can be taken in a non-contextual way, universally, mindlessly, programmatically, then that's very different to the way reputation has operated in community for tens of thousands of years. Not only is it very different from the biomimetic way in which we can understand reputation, we might end up building the Chinese social credit system emergently rather than deliberately. And then you have to say, well, at least the Chinese were honest about what they were building and knew what they were building. We just did it by accident. That's mad. So we can't allow... Seriously, lawmakers need to step up. I understand that this design space is going to need various code bases coming together. So not just technical software code, but also legal code and also social norms, which are quite stubborn. But once they come in, that stubborn becomes a feature rather than a bug. That stubbornness. We're going to have to resist naive approaches to put verifiable credentials, reputation scores, any kind of non-contextual, universal, mindless quantification of who I am, who you are, who Alice is as a person out there. It's in the way I described a reputation panel at this year's Taoist meeting in Amsterdam is that if you've got a panel of nuclear physicists together talking about their fissile materials, there's not one of them on the stage who would not fully comprehend the dangers of the material they work with. I can't say that about too many constituents of the Web3 community at the moment.
Goldfinch is a decentralized credit protocol with a mission to connect the world's capital to the world's growth. Goldfinch focuses on real yields from real companies, so start lending your USDC to real businesses driving growth worldwide. Goldfinch's borrowers are proven fintechs and credit funds in emerging markets who need access to Goldfinch's capital to drive economic growth in regions faced with barriers to financial access. In just under 2 years, Goldfinch has loaned over 100 million USDC, reaching over 1 million people and businesses across 28 countries. Goldfinch is doing what DeFi was always meant to do, expanding financial access to those who have historically been shut out of the TradFi system. So, become a Goldfinch member to put your USDC to work, empowering real businesses' growth. Join Goldfinch's new member vaults to be an active investor and take part in supporting Goldfinch's security and expansion. Receive yield enhancements generated by protocol revenue, plus access exclusive communication channels and more. So go to goldfinch.finance to get started. Working in Web3 is awesome. It's freeing, powerful, and so much fun. But working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many people. OPOLIS is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best, their work, while OPOLIS manages the back end. There's a lot of nation-state overhead when working in Web3, and OPOLIS takes care of all of the back end stuff, freeing you up to do what you do best, your work. OPOLIS leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. So do what you love and maintain your financial security with OPOLIS. You must be authorized to work inside the United States to receive OPOLIS's benefits, but OPOLIS is expanding its services to Canada starting on June 1st of next year. So book a 30-minute free consultation with OPOLIS experts and join OPOLIS by December 31st to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started.
That's a really interesting analog right there. I mean, given how important digital identity is, in terms of making people legible to the internet and to the state, and the upsides and downsides of that, I found that really profound. So,
Well,
I mean, I guess
you had a conversation. Sorry, just to finish on that one, Kevin, if I can. Didn't mean to interrupt, but just while we're on the topic, you had Stani on from Lens Protocol. And Lens Protocol is going through its thing at the moment. Everyone's very excited about it. And actually, you made a point on that episode that you said that Lens is a reaction to Web 2. The idea of the large-scale social graph that Facebook both popularized and effectively owns. I would argue that it's not a reaction to Web 2 because all Lens does, and similar projects, is take the concept of the social graph that Facebook popularized and just put it into a new tech stack. We shouldn't, if the concept remains unchanged, we shouldn't expect it to deliver very different consequences. And the interesting thing about the social graph is it was originally known as the sociogram, and it was a product in the 1930s of a guy called Marino. If you go back into the history of social graphing and look at the sociogram, you find that Marino didn't develop the sociogram to just understand a social group, but to control it.
Yeah.
Right? To influence it is probably a more appropriate phrase. And so if we just have this idea of a monolithic, singular social graph, it doesn't matter if it's centralized or decentralized, we'll find very much that the consequences will be very similar, particularly if, and I'm not going to talk about all of the business models associated with putting the social graph on the blockchain, but if there is any investor looking for an ROI, there's going to be some kind of way in which they will secure that ROI. So there's a commercially motivated social graph, and that's just the same as Web 2.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean,
so again, we just have to, we really have to just question the fundamental working concepts. Are these going to serve us well, or are we just recoding them?
Yeah, I mean, I have two reactions to that. One is that if it's open source and forkable, then like someone like me can go in and change the like mechanism to be a quadratic funding social network. And I think that that is powerful. Like the fact that builders can build their own values on top of that social graph. But I accept your critique that a global social graph is maybe a flawed infrastructure. And, just to like paint a picture of Philip, I think for an entrepreneur and a software engineer, how thin the line that you have to walk when you're building these systems is. And that's not to say that we should not take it seriously, but you have to compete with the Web2 giants on your left, and then you're trying to create something that's based on a better moral philosophy, and so that adds more constraints. And so, I gave this talk at DevCon about Gitcoin Passport, which is something that I was sort of involved in, but basically we designed for network effects so that people would actually use it. And then, in order to make it ethical, we had to build in privacy and sovereignty and systemic defensibility and avoiding plutocracy and decentralization and modularity and forkability from the start. So you're kind of like fighting the Web2 giants with one hand behind your back. And I guess I'm wondering, if I'm a builder out there and I have one thing to take away from this conversation, or maybe three things to take away from this conversation, how do we walk those lines as builders? It sounds like engaging with the social scientists is like one thing that you're advocating, but like, are there any other, well, A, do you accept, sort of my framing on this, and B, what kind of practical advice do you have for people?
Damn, that's an incisive line of questioning.
All right. Well, we have 15 minutes, so I'm sorry, I don't mean to unfairly set you up, but I do think that I really want the audience here is builders, right? So I want to come back to like helping them create a more regenerative cryptoeconomic world, but also be successful. And that's even though it was an incisive line of questioning, that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. There are actually, let me relate this to your sterling work on public goods. There are aspects of biddling in Web3 which the free market, if that's a motivation for you, if I'm not against the for-profit approach to organising, absolutely go for your life, because wonderful innovations come out of the for-profit motivation. There's no doubt about it. However, just in the same way that we have public goods versus private goods, and also common goods in between, so to speak, there are some protocols in the mix in terms of digitalizing human society which should not be subject, in my opinion, to the motivations of the market. I guess in my work in trying to understand how to affect decentralized social, in trying to understand, for example, how we might apply digital technologies to the pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. No matter what problem space, particularly the more wicked the problem became, the more and more I kept coming across this question of human identity as a sense-making capacity, as a process. So for me, the question of generative identity, which is the phrase I use to indicate that we're going to try and design for identity in this digitalized world to prioritize psychological, sociological, and ecological concerns, rather than proving that you're old enough to buy a beer at the bar. Is definitely a public good. Now, once we have a suitably inter/transdisciplinary group working on that problem space, trying to engineer the requisite variety in, then that's fantastic. Any bidder looking for the for-profit motive can riff off that in a plurality of ways. Go for your life. But if they're trying to get that perceived market advantage of being the ones that define their protocol in the first place, because they think they can somehow, if they can move fast and break things, if they can get the first mover advantage, then that's not the way in which I think we're going to find generative identity. I think that's the way to degenerative identity. So at the moment, I would say that self-sovereign identity is definitely reaching its, I would say, peak hype. I'm sure. I don't mean that disrespectively. I'm just in terms of the adoption curve. Quite clearly, it's difficult to build anything in Web3 without giving Alice some kind of, or allowing Alice to take for herself some consistent, constant identifier, because no one has yet worked on coding for verb-like identity.
Yeah.
So whether that continues to be an Ethereum address, an ENS, or some kind of wallet construct, then I would say develop on top of that in a way that doesn't build in the path dependency that would preclude you from swapping that out in the future when the rest of us get our shit together on the fundamental open public good protocol that is a set of approaches to human identity that can then be forked in a plurality of ways by different societies, different cultures around the world to suit their needs. And you know, that process is going on at the moment. So, for example, in New Zealand, if you look at the relationship between the modern New Zealand state and the indigenous people, the Maori have an arrangement with their government which says that, do you know what, if there's anything you're trying to do in the digital realm, that's the context of my understanding anyway, that goes against the way that our society, our culture works, then we should have the bandwidth to adapt that to our needs, to put something between us and the system that you're trying to make us legible to. And so they have a very fascinating digital identity project that's trying to actually live in many ways one take on verb-like identity that's corresponds to their particular culture. And there are other small projects around the world, as you can imagine, because there's no money in it, in that for-profit way, they tend to be slightly less well-resourced than those that get the VC money. But it's out there, Kevin. And we can convene that insight, that indigenous knowledge. We can convene the knowledge of the sociologists and the psychologists. We can explore what it means to be, to maintain narrative selves in the digital age. We can riff off a wonderful corpus of work. So, for example, if you take Sherry Turkle, she's just one of the foremost people who've studied this space. By the end of the 90s, she was saying the internet's amazing. It's an identity workshop. You can be who you want to be. Here in the 2020s, it's like people are struggling to think, how can we get civil resistance? It's a really hard problem. I don't see it like that at all. There is no doubt in my mind that by default, civil resistance will be, air quotes, solved by the end of the 20s, by the accretion of many people trying to work on the project, but continuing to do just what they do in the computer science mindset, in the reductionist mindset. In fact, the challenge by the end of this decade will be, oh my God, how on earth do we get rid of this civil resistance? This is strangling us. This is constraining us. This is not what it means to be human. This is not my body that I'm bringing to this party. It's my mind. So, just to recap, the answer to your question is keep riffing. Just don't quite. I would say if you have a for-profit motivation, don't try and do identity and reputation, which is almost you can't separate the two. Don't go in that space. Let's look at that one really diligently, because that's the only way we're going to get to the third attractor. That's the only way we're going to get to decentralized society.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like, one thing I might boil down, and, apologies for always trying to take this in a reductivist direction.
Don't mention bloody Lego, right? Because if there's one, I know you love Lego, right? Seriously, there's nothing complex about Lego.
Yeah. Well, no, I was going to say, like, the knowledge Lego I was going to propose is, like, first do no harm when you're developing digital identity. The nuclear, like, we're like nuclear physicists all LARPing online about how we're going to create the future of digital identity. And we just have to realize that it could go very poorly if we build it wrong. And I think that's one big takeaway for me from your episode and your critique of some of the other stuff that the Green Pill audience and the Green Pill guests have been doing.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. Just to bring this right back to where we started, I'm a doomer optimist. In fact, actually, we are doing what I think is going to be the way in which we continue to do great things together. Let me explain that. You and I are having a conversation. There is no way that our minds can interact over Wi-Fi, near-field communication, Bluetooth, cables. I know some people are working on it, we have to rely on conversation in order to find meaning together and resolve to understand the values that we want to live going forward, the very definition of autonomy. It comes down to conversation. There's not to get too academic, there's a fantastic paper by Double Ian Pangaro from 2015. We'll stick it in the show notes if that's okay. And it basically says that if you are a designer, and they don't mean that in the sense of designing a glass, but designing something of import, like complex adaptive systems, then you are into cybernetics, the science of organizing, the science of setting and pursuing goals in complex situations. If you're into cybernetics, then you're into second order cybernetics, which is kind of reflexive. It's applying cybernetics to yourself, embedding the observer as opposed to that plan B way, which says let's rise above it and look down as if it's a board game. And if you're into second order cybernetics, then you must necessarily be into conversation, not general chit chat as we engage in over the garden fence, but well-designed conversation that benefits the pursuit of mutual understanding. Not necessarily agreement, we'll still disagree, but at least we'll understand why each other thinks slightly differently. And if, again, to Jordan Hall and Dan Schmartenberger's conversations with yourself, if we can then free up people's attention away from shit jobs and doom scrolling to meaningful conversations in their social groups, in their cultures, in their societies, such that we can build mutual understanding. We can get away from that Web 2 polarization of community and bring people sort of back roughly to the center again-ish. Still be a distribution, but it won't be polarized. It will be one of those. What a wonderful thing. So to me, with identity defined reciprocally and inseparably with relationships and information exchange, conversation, then designing for conversation is part and parcel of designing for identity. And we have, I believe, all the knowledge, the know-how, we have the know-why. We just need to go at it. And it's the mother of all public goods in our context here.
Yeah. Well, I think those are really profound and beautiful words to end on. But given that we only have 2 more minutes before we have to wrap, is there anything else that you want to leave the audience with? I think for me, I would love to direct the audience to your beautiful essay on Web3 identity. So we'll put that in the show notes. But any final words or things that I didn't ask you that you want to say?
I'm going to actually, I would like to give one of your previous guests the last words on this episode, and that's Glenn Wine. I love what he's trying to do with decentralized society. I look at the self-bound tokens paper not as a manual, actually, God forbid that anybody interprets it as a manual, but as a provocation. It seems contradictory in places, in as much as on one hand it says we can get civil resistance by correlating souls, and then later it says, well, we shouldn't correlate souls. So, it's a bundle of thinking. It's like let's get this out there. It's thinking out loud, and I love that. That's to be celebrated. And he has he blogged, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago now about something, an acronym he called ALONE, and I think it speaks to the crux of the matter you and I have discussed today about the reductionist, linear, stack-based approach of computer science versus the ecology of social sciences. He defines ALONE as ALONE, atomistic liberalism and objectivist naive epistemology. I'm already thinking, hang on a minute, you said to me earlier, Kevin, we shouldn't get too hung up on the jargon, but then he defines it in words that are not jargon at all. If you're in the ALONE mindset, then you approach the design challenge as a binary between individuals atomized on one side, and then some kind of, those, by that atomization, it means that they're pre-social. You don't even think of them as social animals. They're just individual people. And then, So the alone mindset as a binary of the individual and then something really big, like society, the nation state, the modeler, God, right? And he's basically saying in this post that if you're thinking in that binary, as I would say the self-sovereign identity community does, then you're automating away everything in between. That beautiful, natural, awe-inspiring complexity. And so if you're in the alone model of the world, then, in his words, you are being wildly naive and inaccurate in your approach. Here's the complexity, my man.
I love it. I think that this is a really important episode in that it generates some pushback and some complexification of the thinking that we've done on the Green Pill Pod so far. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So we're going to cut it here. Philip, thank you so much for joining and sharing your thoughts with us. And to the audience, please check out Philip's essay. It'll be in the show notes.
Kevin, thank you for doing everything that you do. You are convening a very important conversation with the Green Pill. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Cheers.